Welcome to tonight's stories. These tales will be accompanied by the gentle sound of rain to help you drift off to sleep. Before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. Leave a comment below. It's fascinating to see how our community spans different time zones, all united in seeking a peaceful night's rest. Now make yourself comfortable, adjust your volume, and let the rain and story guide you into peaceful dreams. Our story begins.
Maya never thought silence could have a sound until that night. The old Victorian house had always been quiet after sunset, but this was different. This silence had weight, presence, like a low-frequency humming just below the threshold of hearing. She sat in her grandfather's leather armchair, trying to focus on grading papers from her 8th grade English class, but the silence kept pulling at her attention. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, its deep resonance echoing through the empty rooms. Maya jumped, scattering red-marked essays across the hardwood floor. Her hand pressed against her chest, feeling her racing heart beneath her wool sweater. "Get it together," she muttered, kneeling to gather the papers. "You've been alone in this house hundreds of times, but never during a power outage. Never when the temperature outside had dropped to single digits and the ancient heating system had gone quiet. Never when her phone was dead and her car wouldn't start." Leaving her truly isolated in the rambling Victorian, her grandfather had left her 6 months ago. The candlelight from the coffee table cast dancing shadows on the walls. Maya had always loved how the flames made the dark wood paneling glow warm and rich, but tonight the shadows seemed deeper, more purposeful in their movements. She caught herself tracking their patterns, searching for meaning in their dance. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Maya froze, papers clutched forgotten in her hands. The sound had come from directly above her, from her grandfather's old study that she'd locked after his funeral. No one had been up there since. Another creak, slower this time, like someone testing their weight on the ancient boards. "Hello!" Her voice sounded thin and brittle in the heavy silence. "Is someone there?" The silence swallowed her words whole. Maya stood slowly, her joints stiff from the cold. The temperature had been dropping steadily since the power went out 3 hours ago. She could see her breath now, little puffs of vapor that dissipated in the candlelight. The rational part of her mind supplied explanations. Old houses settle, with contracts in the cold. Air pressure changes can make doors and floorboards shift. Her grandfather had told her all of this when she was little and convinced the house was haunted. He'd been a physics professor, always ready with scientific explanations for the seemingly supernatural. But he'd also kept his study locked, and never explained why. Another creak, followed by the distinct sound of footsteps crossing the floor above. Maya's hands trembled as she picked up one of the thick pillar candles. The flame wavered, making the shadows leap. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I'm armed," she called out, wincing at how unconvincing she sounded. "I'm calling the police right now." A lie with her phone dead, but maybe it would scare off an intruder. If it was an intruder. The footsteps stopped. Maya edged toward the foyer, where the grand staircase curved up to the second floor. The candle's light barely reached the top of the stairs, leaving the upper landing in darkness. As she reached the bottom step, a cold draft swept down from above, making the flame gutter. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. "Promise me you'll never go into the study alone, Maya. Promise me." She'd promised, more to humor him than anything else. But now, standing at the base of the stairs with that impossible silence pressing in around her, she wondered what he'd known that he'd never shared. The first step creaked under her weight. Maya paused, listening. Nothing but the silence, growing thicker by the second. Another step, another. The carpet runner muffled her footsteps, but each board seemed to announce her presence to whatever waited above. Halfway up, she heard it. A soft scratching sound from the study, like fingernails dragging slowly across wood. Maya's breath caught in her throat. The scratching continued, methodical and deliberate. She thought of her grandfather's heavy oak desk, its surface marked with dozens of shallow grooves that she'd always assumed came from years of use. The scratching stopped. She stood frozen on the stairs, heart pounding so hard she was sure it must be audible in the silence. The candlelight barely reached the top few steps now, and the darkness beyond seemed to pulse with possibility. A shadow moved across the sliver of light she could see beneath the study door. Maya's grip tightened on the candle holder. 5 more steps to the landing. 4, 3. The floorboards felt colder with each step, the chill seeping through her wool socks. 2 steps left when she heard the doorknob turn. The sound was deafening in the silence, metal grinding against metal as the lock mechanism rotated. Maya stood transfixed, watching as the brass knob slowly completed its revolution. The door remained closed. Her grandfather's voice again. "If you ever hear anything from the study at night, Maya, don't investigate. Leave the house immediately." But she couldn't move. Her legs felt leaden, rooted to the step as the doorknob began to turn back in the opposite direction. Then forward again, back and forth like something testing the mechanism, learning how it worked. The scratching resumed, but not on wood this time. The sound came from inside the lock itself, delicate and precise. Maya thought of lockpicks, of skeleton keys, of things far older and stranger that might want to open a door. With a final click, the lock disengaged. The silence that followed was absolute. Maya couldn't even hear her own breathing, though her chest rose and fell rapidly. The candlelight seemed dimmer now, barely illuminating her hands. The door opened inward, slowly and smoothly, without a sound. Darkness lay beyond, deeper than the natural absence of light. Maya raised the candle, but the flame seemed to stop at the threshold, as if the darkness was something solid, something that could resist illumination. A current of air flowed from the study, carrying with it the musty smell of old books and something else, something metallic and sharp that made her think of copper pennies and winter frost. Movement in the darkness, a suggestion of form, of mass shifting in ways that seemed to defy geometry. The scratch of something being dragged across the floor. Maya's paralysis broke. She turned and fled down the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, the candle's flame whipping wildly. Behind her, she heard the distinct sound of footsteps following, matching her pace exactly. She reached the bottom and sprinted for the front door, fumbling with the deadbolt. The key stuck, refusing to turn. Above her, the footsteps reached the landing and started down. Maya abandoned the door and ran for the kitchen, where the back door offered another escape. The candle went out as she ran, plunging her into darkness broken only by the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. The footsteps behind her never quickened, never slowed, maintaining their steady rhythm. Yet somehow they were getting closer. She burst into the kitchen and slammed the door behind her, knowing even as she did so that it wouldn't help. The footsteps approached the door, still keeping that same measured pace. The back door was 10 feet away. Maya lunged for it, hands outstretched in the darkness. Her fingers closed around the handle just as the kitchen door opened. Cold air washed over her, carrying that metallic scent now tinged with decay. She could feel presence behind her, sense the weight of attention focused on her back. The door handle wouldn't turn. "Please," she whispered, not sure who or what she was pleading with. "Please." The presence drew closer. Maya squeezed her eyes shut, not wanting to see what cast the shadow she could now feel falling over her. A hand touched her shoulder. The fingers were long and cold, their grip gentle but immovable. "Maya," a voice said, familiar and wrong all at once. It sounded like her grandfather's voice run backward, like words spoken underwater. "Maya, I need to show you something in the study." She shook her head, eyes still closed. "You're not him. You're not real." The hand squeezed slightly. "Open your eyes, Maya. Look at me. I've waited so long to show you." Against her will, she felt her eyes beginning to open. The metallic smell was overwhelming now, and she could feel cold breath on the back of her neck. A sudden bang from the front of the house made them both freeze. A voice called out, "Maya, are you home? The power's out on the whole block. I brought some emergency supplies." It was her neighbor, Mark. Maya had never been so grateful to hear another human voice. The hand on her shoulder withdrew. When she spun around, the kitchen was empty, though the air still carried that corrupt metallic scent. She ran to the front door, shouting Mark's name. This time the key turned easily, and she threw herself into the snowy night, into the blessed light of Mark's flashlight. She never went back into the house alone. When she finally hired someone to clean out the study, they found the desk covered in fresh grooves, and a message scratched into the wood. "I'm still waiting to show you, Maya." The house stood empty after that, but on quiet nights, neighbors sometimes reported seeing candlelight in the upstairs window and hearing the slow, steady sound of footsteps pacing back and forth. And if you listen carefully in the silence, you might hear scratching, like fingernails on wood, growing louder as something tests the locks, learning how they work, waiting for another chance to show what lies behind the study door. Maya sold the house 6 months later, but she never stopped looking over her shoulder in quiet moments. She moved to a busy apartment in the city, where the constant noise of traffic and neighbors kept the silence at bay. But sometimes, late at night, she still hears phantom footsteps matching her pace exactly, and feels the ghost of long, cold fingers on her shoulder. She never found out what her grandfather had wanted to show her in the study. Some questions, she decided, are better left unanswered. Some doors are meant to stay locked, but the silence knows. The silence remembers. And in the darkest hours of night, when the world grows still and the shadows deepen, the silence waits with infinite patience for someone else to climb those stairs, to turn that brass doorknob, to finally see what waits behind the study door. Just remember, if you ever find yourself alone in an old house at night, and the silence starts to feel like a presence, don't investigate that sound from upstairs. Don't open that locked door. And whatever you do, don't look back when you hear footsteps matching your pace exactly. Because some mysteries don't want to be solved. Some secrets are kept for a reason. And sometimes, the most terrifying truth is the one that waits patiently in the darkness, calling your name in a voice that sounds almost, but not quite, like someone you used to love. James Mitchell hadn't seen another human being in 48 days. The remote research station, perched high in the Alaskan wilderness, had been his sole companion since the last supply helicopter departed in early November. As a climate researcher studying winter weather patterns, solitude was part of the job. But tonight, as the wind howled outside and temperatures plummeted to -30, he wished he wasn't quite so alone. The research station was modern, a prefabricated structure of steel and insulated panels, nothing like the rustic cabins that dotted the Alaskan wilderness. It was designed to withstand the harshest conditions nature could throw at it. Yet somehow, the building seemed fragile tonight, a tiny island of warmth in an ocean of pristine white wilderness. James sat at his desk, analyzing data from his weather sensors, when the first anomaly appeared. The temperature gauge at Station 4, located 2 miles north, showed an impossible reading, plus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, in the middle of an Alaskan winter night. "Equipment malfunction," he muttered, making a note in his log. He'd have to ski out tomorrow to check the sensor, though the thought of traveling that far in these conditions made his stomach clench. The station's heating system hummed steadily, fighting against the bitter cold. Outside his window, snow fell in thick curtains, reducing visibility to mere feet. His own reflection stared back at him from the glass, a man in his early 30s with 3 days of stubble and tired eyes. The sensor at Station 4 beeped again. Now it read -120 degrees. James frowned. Equipment didn't usually malfunction this dramatically. He pulled up the data from the other stations. All normal, showing temperatures around -30, exactly what you'd expect. A sharp crack echoed through the station, like a gunshot. James jumped, his heart racing. Ice, he told himself, just the structure contracting in the cold. He'd heard similar sounds before, though never quite this loud. The lights flickered. "Don't you dare," he warned the electrical system. The station had backup generators, but he really didn't want to go outside to start them in this weather. The sensor at Station 4 beeped a third time. The reading now simply showed error, followed by a string of random characters. Another crack, closer this time, followed by a sound like scratching. It seemed to come from the wall behind him, metal against metal, deliberate and slow. James turned slowly in his chair. The wall was blank, just smooth white panels. But the scratching continued, moving across the surface like something was tracing a pattern he couldn't see. His satellite phone lay on the desk. He picked it up, telling himself he was being paranoid, but wanting to check in with his supervisor anyway. No signal. That was unusual. The station had a powerful antenna specifically designed to maintain satellite contact in any weather. The scratching stopped. In the sudden silence, James could hear his own breathing, too fast and shallow. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he realized something else. The heating system had gone quiet. He checked the terminal showing station systems. The temperature inside was dropping rapidly, already down 5 degrees in the last minute. No warning messages, no indication of system failure. The heat had simply stopped. The lights flickered again and went out. James sat in total darkness, heart pounding. His hand fumbled for the flashlight he kept in his desk drawer. The beam seemed weak, barely penetrating the darkness. Another crack, this time from above, followed by the distinct sound of footsteps on the roof. That was impossible. The station's roof was smooth metal, tilted at a 45-degree angle specifically to prevent snow accumulation. There was nothing to walk on, and in this weather, no one could possibly be up there. The footsteps moved slowly, deliberately, crossing directly over his head. They reached the edge of the roof, paused, and then started back. James's hands shook as he reached for the satellite phone again. Still no signal. His personal cell phone was equally useless, no service this far from civilization. The station's internet connection was down too, cutting him off completely. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. He could see his breath now, illuminated in the flashlight beam. Something scraped against one of the windows, like claws on glass. James swung the flashlight toward the sound, but the heavy snow made it impossible to see anything outside. The footsteps on the roof stopped directly above him. A loud thud shook the ceiling, as if something heavy had dropped onto the roof. Then another, and another, moving closer to the edge. James backed away from the window, flashlight beam darting between it and the ceiling. The rational part of his mind supplied explanations. Ice falling from the antenna tower, wind-blown debris, the structure settling in the cold. But none of those explanations covered what happened next. A face appeared at the window. James caught only a glimpse pale flesh, wrong proportions, too many angles, before he instinctively looked away. But that glimpse was enough to send him stumbling backward, knocking over his chair. The scratching resumed, this time at every wall simultaneously, like dozens of metal claws dragging across the surface. The temperature plummeted, frost crystallizing on the windows. And then, clearly audible over the scratching and the wind, a voice. "Let me in, James." The voice was wrong, multiple tones layered together, some too high, some too low to be human. Spoke again. "I've come such a long way to see you." The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Frost crept across the floor, spreading from the walls. The flashlight beam dimmed further, as if the darkness was something physical, pressing in around him. "The others screamed when they saw me," the voice said. "Will you scream, James?" James ran. He bolted from his office toward the station's reinforced main door, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of him. The scratching followed, racing along the walls parallel to his path. Frost spread across every surface he passed, crackling as it formed. "Running only makes it more interesting," the layered voice said, now seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Ask the research team from 97. Ask the surveyors from 83. Oh wait, a sound like grinding metal that might have been laughter. You can't." James reached the main door and grabbed the handle. It was so cold it burned his palm, but he yanked anyway. The door didn't budge. "I froze the mechanism," the voice said, almost apologetically. "Safety feature. Wouldn't want anything getting in from outside. Or out." The scratching converged on his position. James spun around, pressing his back against the door. In the flashlight's failing beam, he saw long marks appearing in the wall's metal panels, cutting through the steel like it was paper. The temperature had dropped so low his tears were freezing on his cheeks. The darkness pressed closer, and now he could see something moving in it, shapes that shouldn't exist, geometries that hurt his eyes. The cold preserves things, James. That's why I like it here. Would you like to see what I've preserved? Images flashed in his mind, frozen faces locked in screams. Bodies contorted in impossible angles, all perfectly preserved in the deep Arctic ice. He didn't know if they were visions or memories being forced into his head. The flashlight died. In the perfect darkness, James heard movement. Something was in the hallway with him, its mass displacing the air in ways that felt wrong. Cold radiated from it in waves. Open your eyes, James. I want you to see me properly this time. His eyes were already open, straining against the darkness. Shapes began to form not from light, but from the absence of it. Spaces where the darkness was somehow darker. A hand touched his face. The fingers were long, jointed in too many places, radiating a cold so intense it felt like burning. James screamed then, the sound torn from him by primal terror. He ducked under the reaching hand and ran blindly down the hallway, bouncing off walls, guided only by his knowledge of the station's layout. The thing followed, no longer bothering to hide its movement. The floor shook with its pursuit, the metal walls groaning as it passed. James reached the station's small kitchen and slammed the door, knowing it wouldn't help. His hands found the cabinet where he kept emergency supplies. Inside was a flare gun, standard safety equipment for signaling helicopters. The door exploded inward, taking part of the wall with it. James raised the flare gun and fired. The magnesium flare ignited with a blinding flash, filling the kitchen with harsh red light. For a split second, James saw the thing clearly. He would spend years trying to forget what he saw in that moment. The creature filled the doorway, its form constantly shifting like smoke, but somehow still solid. Parts of it resembled a human body, but they were assembled wrong, limbs emerging from impossible angles, too many joints bending in wrong directions. His faces rippled across its surface, features dissolving and reforming. The flare lodged in what might have been its center mass. Instead of burning it, the flare seemed to be consumed, the light dimming as if being pulled into a void. Pretty, the thing said in its layered voice, but light is just another form of energy, and cold is the absence of energy. Let me show you. The last of the flare's light vanished. In the renewed darkness, James felt the temperature drop even further. His breath turned to ice crystals that tinkled like wind chimes as they fell. He groped along the counter, found the handle of a heavy pot, and swung it with all his strength at where he'd last seen the creature. The pot passed through empty air. Behind you, the voice whispered. James spun. Cold fingers wrapped around his throat, lifting him off his feet. The touch was like being branded with ice. The last researcher tried to fight too, the thing said conversationally. He lasted 3 days before the cold took him. Shall we see if you can beat his record? Images flooded James's mind again. A man huddled in a corner, skin black with frostbite, whispering to himself as the thing watched. The same man trying to walk across the station, leaving a trail of frozen blood as his dying flesh cracked and split. No, James croaked. Please. The creature's grip loosened slightly. Oh, are you offering something better? What do you want? The faces rippled across its surface again, settling momentarily into an approximation of a smile. Company. It's lonely out here in the white silence. I want someone to talk to, someone to play with, someone to share the cold with. It set James down but kept its hand on his throat. The cold spread from its touch, creeping through his body. The others didn't last long enough to have a proper conversation. But you're different, aren't you, James? You understand the cold. You study it. Perhaps you'll be more resilient. Yes, James said, his mind racing. Yes, I understand the cold. I've spent years studying it. The creature's grip remained icy on his throat. but it didn't tighten. The faces rippled across its surface with interest. "Tell me," it said, its layered voice curious. "Tell me what you understand." James fought to keep his voice steady. "Cold is the absence of energy. Everything seeks equilibrium. Heat flows to cold. Energy disperses until everything stops," the creature finished. "Until perfect stillness, perfect silence." Its form shifted, expanding to fill more of the kitchen. "That's what I am, James. I am the final equilibrium, the heat death of the universe given form." The cold continued spreading from its touch, creeping through James's body. He could no longer feel his extremities. "But that's wrong," he whispered. The creature's surface rippled. "What? Perfect equilibrium is impossible in an expanding universe. There's always energy somewhere, always movement, always life." The grip on his throat tightened. "You think you understand thermodynamics? I was there when your son was born. I will be there when it dies. Then you know." James could barely speak through the cold, but he forced the words out. "You know about chaos theory, about complex systems, about how life always finds a way to create order from chaos, to generate heat from cold." "Silence!" The creature roared, its form writhing. "I am the end of all things, the final—" "No," James interrupted. "You're just another form of energy, and energy can be redirected." His numb hand found the kitchen's gas stove. With the last of his strength, he twisted the knob. The hiss of gas was barely audible. "What are you doing?" the creature demanded. James' smile was closer to a grimace. Creating a complex system, his other hand closed around the emergency lighter from his pocket. "You wouldn't," the creature said. "You'll die too. Better than letting you find someone else. Better than letting you keep what's in the ice." The creature's grip tightened again, frost spreading across James's face. "I'll freeze you before you can do it. Add you to my collection." "Too late," James whispered, and flicked the lighter. The explosion was deafening in the confined space. A fireball erupted from the stove, engulfing them both. The creature screamed, a sound like glaciers calving, like metal tearing, like the death of stars. Heat blasted through the kitchen. The creature's form began to dissolve, its cold overwhelmed by the sudden massive influx of energy. It tried to maintain its shape, but physics was inexorable. Heat flowed to cold. Energy sought equilibrium. The creature's grip failed as its form destabilized. James collapsed, his consciousness fading. Through blurry eyes, he watched the thing that called itself the end of all things dissipate like fog in sunlight. The last thing he heard was the station's fire suppression system activating, and then darkness took him. He woke in a hospital in Anchorage 3 days later. They told him the station's emergency beacon had activated automatically when it detected the fire. A rescue team had found him half frozen but alive, with severe frostbite and burns that somehow existed side by side on his flesh. The station was a total loss. The official report blamed an equipment malfunction and gas leak. His own report mentioned nothing about what he'd seen. Who would believe him? But he requested a transfer to a tropical research station anyway. Let someone else study the cold. He'd had enough of winter silence and what lived in it. Years later, on nights when the temperature drops and the wind howls, he sometimes thinks he hears scratching at his walls. On those nights, he turns up the heat, turns on every light, and remembers what he learned in that frozen station. That there are things in this world that seek perfect cold, perfect silence, perfect stillness. But he also remembers that where there is life, there is heat. Where there is humanity, there is noise and chaos and movement. And sometimes that's enough to keep the darkness at bay. Just don't look too closely at the shadows on winter nights. Don't listen too carefully to the silence between snowflakes. And if you ever find yourself alone in the frozen waste, and the cold seems to have a mind of its own, don't let it talk to you, because once it starts talking, it never wants to stop. They found strange markings in the ruins of the station, deep grooves in the metal that shouldn't have been possible. The recovery team reported odd temperature readings, places where their thermometers showed impossible numbers. And in the deepest winter nights, when the aurora dances above the Arctic Circle, some say they can still hear voices in the wind-layered voices, speaking of cold and silence and the end of all things. But that's just a story, isn't it? Michael Walsh knew he should have listened to the warnings about the mountain pass. The rental car's GPS had suggested the longer route around the mountains, but he'd ignored it, confident in his driving skills and eager to reach his destination before the storm hit. Now, as darkness fell and snow began to blanket the narrow mountain road, he was paying for that arrogance. The storm had come faster than any forecast predicted. 1 minute he'd been driving under overcast skies, and the next he was in the middle of a whiteout. His headlights barely penetrated the wall of swirling snow, and the road's edge markers were becoming harder to spot. Just 5 more miles, he muttered, checking the GPS. The screen flickered, then went dark. He tapped it, but nothing happened. Perfect. The radio had stopped working an hour ago, dissolving into static before dying completely. His cell phone showed no service, which wasn't surprising this deep in the mountains. He was completely alone on this road. He hadn't seen another car since turning onto the mountain pass. Something dark flashed across the road ahead. Michael slammed on the brakes, but the car began to slide. He turned into the skid as he'd been taught, but the rental's tires found no purchase on the increasingly icy surface. The world spun in his headlights: snow, trees, guardrail, snow again, before the car slammed to a stop in a deep drift. The engine died. No, no, no! He turned the key. The starter clicked weakly, then nothing. The battery indicator light flickered once and went out, along with all the dashboard lights. Michael sat in the sudden darkness, listening to the wind howl around the car. The temperature was already dropping without the heater running. His breath fogged in front of him, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the snow. He hadn't seen what had crossed the road. A deer maybe, or a wolf. Something big enough to make him swerve. A loud thump came from the trunk. Michael froze, hands still on the wheel. The sound came again, like something heavy shifting. That was impossible. He'd loaded his own luggage, just 2 bags in the trunk, nothing else. He'd checked it himself when he'd rented the car this morning. Another thump, followed by a scratching sound. "Hello?" he called out, immediately feeling foolish. Of course, there was no one in the trunk. Just luggage shifting as the car settled in the snow. Just a scream cut through the howling wind, high, desperate, and terrifyingly human. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Michael's hands shook as he checked the doors were locked. The car suddenly felt very fragile, a thin shell of metal and glass between him and whatever was out there in the storm. The scratching moved from the trunk to the rear passenger door, metal claws dragging along the car's frame. It circled around to his door, pausing just inches from his window. He held his breath, afraid even that small sound would give him away. The snow pressed against the windows, leaving only darkness visible outside. The scratching stopped. A face appeared at his window. Michael jerked away so violently he hit his head on the opposite window. The face was pressed against the glass. Features distorted, pale flesh stretched too tight over impossible angles. Eyes too large and too dark, mouth frozen in a rictus grin that showed far too many teeth. It tapped the glass with one long, blackened finger. The sound was almost polite. "Car trouble?" The voice was wrong, like multiple voices speaking slightly out of sync. "I could help. Just unlock the door." Michael couldn't look away from those eyes' deep black pits that seemed to swallow what little light remained. "No thank you," he managed to whisper. The thing's grin widened impossibly further. "Are you sure? So cold out here. Getting colder in there too, I bet. How long until the hypothermia sets in, do you think?" As if to emphasize its point, another violent shiver ran through Michael's body. The temperature in the car was dropping rapidly. The last one lasted almost 4 hours. The thing continued conversationally. Kept trying to start his car until his fingers were too frozen to turn the key. Would have been faster if he'd just opened the door. Kinder, too, pressed its face closer to the glass. Frost spread from where its flesh touched the window. I can smell your fear, Michael. It's delicious. Almost as good as your warmth will be. Michael's blood ran cold. He hadn't told it his name. How? He started to ask. I know lots of things, it said. I know you're running from something. I know why you left Boston in such a hurry. I know about the money and the people looking for you. I know you thought this remote road would be safer. It laughed, a sound like breaking icicles. You were wrong. The thing raised its hand and pressed its palm flat against the window. The glass began to frost over, ice crystals spreading in intricate patterns. The temperature plummeted further. Last chance, it said. Open the door now and I'll make it quick. Keep it locked. Its grin somehow widened even further. Well, there are so many fascinating things that happen to the human body as it freezes. Would you like me to describe them? Michael's survival instinct finally kicked in. He lunged across to the passenger seat, away from those terrible eyes. His hand found his backpack and yanked it open, searching frantically for anything that might help. Oh, the running begins, the thing said, its layered voice filled with amusement. I do love this part. The scratching resumed, moving around the car. Snow whirled against the windows, making it impossible to track the creature's movement. Michael's fingers closed around his flashlight, a heavy tactical model he'd bought for emergencies. It wouldn't save him, but its weight was reassuring. A sharp crack came from the rear window. Michael spun around to see a spiderweb of cracks spreading across the glass, frost forming along each line. Glass is such a fragile thing, the creature mused. Like life, both shatter so easily in the cold. Another crack, this time from the passenger window. More fractures appeared, spreading like ice across a pond. Michael's mind raced. The thing was right about hypothermia. Without heat, he'd freeze to death in hours. But opening the door was suicide. There had to be another option. The rear window cracked again, pieces of glass beginning to fall inward. Cold wind whistled through the gaps, bringing swirling snow into the car. I can smell your warmth, the thing whispered, its voice coming from everywhere at once, like a candle in the darkness. Would you like to know what your blood will look like on the snow? It freezes in such interesting patterns. Michael's hands shook as he checked his phone again. Still no signal. The temperature had dropped so low that his breath now froze instantly, ice crystals falling like tiny diamonds in the beam of his flashlight. A new sound cut through the wind, a low, wet tearing, like meat being pulled apart. It was followed by the click of bones snapping back into new configurations. Would you like to see what I really look like? The thing asked. The others screamed so beautifully when they saw. Their fear was exquisite. Shadows moved outside the car, suggesting shapes that shouldn't exist. Michael caught glimpses of limbs too long and jointed wrong, of flesh that flowed like wax but never melted. The rear window finally gave way with a sound like breaking chimes. Cold air rushed in, bringing with it the smell of decay and ancient ice. Something began to squeeze through the opening, pale flesh flowing and reforming as it pushed through gaps that should have been too small. Michael did the only thing he could think of. He raised the flashlight and clicked it on, aiming the beam directly at the thing coming through the window. It screamed, a sound like glaciers calving, like 1,000 voices crying out in agony. The flesh retreating from the light, smoke rising where the beam touched it. Light, Michael whispered. You hate light, the creature hissed, a sound that made his teeth ache. Clever boy, but batteries die, and I have all night. As if on cue, the flashlight flickered. Michael shook it frantically, but the beam was already growing weaker. Did you know humans can survive the loss of fingers and toes? The thing asked conversationally, circling back to his window. The body sacrifices extremities to preserve core temperature. I love watching that process. The black spread so slowly at first, then faster and faster. The flashlight flickered again. In the dying beam, Michael saw movement in the swirling snow, shapes flowing together and apart, suggesting a form too large to really exist in this reality. Your light is fading, the thing said. Like your warmth, like your life. Why prolong the inevitable? Michael's mind raced. The creature was right about the light, but wrong about something else. This wasn't inevitable. Nothing was inevitable until you stopped fighting. His eyes fell on the car's glove compartment. Inside would be the rental car documents, insurance papers, and a road flare. All rental cars in this region were required to carry them during winter. "What are you thinking about, Michael?" the thing asked. "I can smell your hope. It's misplaced." The flashlight beam dimmed further. Michael took a deep breath, tightening his grip on the failing light. "Want to know what I'm thinking?" he asked, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Tell me," the thing said, pressing its face against his window again. Those black eyes fixed on him, hungry and ancient. "I'm thinking about chemistry," Michael said. "About magnesium and oxygen and what happens when they meet." The thing's grin faltered for the first time. Michael moved faster than he'd ever moved in his life. He lunged for the glove compartment as his flashlight finally died, plunging the car into darkness. The thing laughed, that terrible sound of breaking ice, as it began to flow through every crack and gap in the car's frame. "Magnesium burns at over 4,000 degrees, Michael said, fingers closing around the flare. "Hot enough to split water into hydrogen and oxygen." "Clever boy," the thing mocked, its voice now inside the car. But not clever enough. Cold fingers brushed the back of Michael's neck. The touch burned like liquid nitrogen, spreading numbness through his flesh. He fumbled with the flare's cap as shadows writhed around him. "I've eaten scientists before," the creature said. "Their knowledge didn't save them. Nothing can save you from the cold. From me," the cap came off. Michael's fingers, nearly numb, found the striker. "Last chance," the thing whispered, its breath like Arctic wind against his ear. "Open the door. Accept the cold. It will be easier." "You know what's interesting about magnesium?" Michael asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. "It doesn't just make light. It makes its own oxygen. Can burn underwater. Can burn in snow." The thing finished, its layered voice showing the first hint of uncertainty. Michael struck the flare. The magnesium ignited with a sound like a small explosion. Brilliant white light filled the car, brighter than daylight, brighter than the sun reflecting off snow. The creature screamed. Not its mocking laugh this time, but a sound of genuine pain. The shadows retreated from the light, trying to flow back out through the broken window. But Michael was ready. He thrust the flare toward the thing's core mass, where the shadows were thickest. The magnesium flame touched otherworldly flesh. What happened next defied description. The creature's form lost all cohesion, spreading across the car's interior like ink in water, but everywhere the light touched, it began to burn. The scream rose to impossible frequencies as the thing tried desperately to escape the fire that seemed to burn in more dimensions than should exist. "Light is energy," Michael said through gritted teeth, pressing his advantage. "Energy is the opposite of cold, the opposite of you." The thing's flesh began to boil away wherever the magnesium touched it. The car filled with a smell like burning meat and ozone, like lightning striking ancient ice. Its many voices cried out in languages that had been dead for millennia. "You're not death," Michael continued, his voice stronger now. "You're not the end. You're just another predator. And predators can die." The creature made one last attempt to reform, to reach for him with limbs that were already burning away. But the magnesium flame was relentless, burning hotter and brighter, consuming shadow and cold alike. With a final shriek that shattered every remaining window in the car, the thing dissolved into nothing, leaving only frost that quickly melted in the flare's heat. Michael sat shaking in the sudden quiet, holding the still-burning flare. The wind had died completely. The snow falling outside his shattered windows seemed normal now, just frozen water, nothing more. The car's engine turned over suddenly, dashboard lights flickering back to life. His phone beeped, showing full signal. The GPS rebooted, cheerfully recalculating his route. He sat there until the flare burned out, then carefully took out his second one, keeping it close. The heater was working again, fighting back the cold, but he couldn't stop shivering. When dawn finally came, he found no traces of the creature, no marks on the car except those that could be explained by the cold. No evidence of his struggle except the spent flare and his own frost-burned skin where it had touched him. The local mechanic who towed him out said he was lucky people died on this road every winter, caught in sudden storms, found frozen in their cars with strange looks on their faces. Some, the mechanic said more quietly, were found with marks that couldn't be explained, their bodies twisted in ways that violated anatomy. Michael never drove that road again. He took the long way around the mountains, no matter how much time it added to his journey. And he kept his car stocked with flares, more than strictly necessary, more than could be explained by safety regulations. Because sometimes, on the coldest nights, when snow falls thick and silent, he thinks he hears scratching at his window. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, he catches glimpses of shadows that move wrong, of pale faces with too wide grins pressed against the glass. But he keeps his flares close, keeps his lights burning, remembers that even the deepest cold can be fought with enough heat, enough light, enough will to survive. And if you ever find yourself on a lonely mountain road in winter, when the snow erases all signs of civilization and the darkness feels alive, keep your lights on, keep your windows closed, and if something comes scratching at your car, asking to be let in, remember that some things that walk in the winter dark are older than humanity, colder than ice, hungrier than any natural predator. Remember that they know your name, know your fears, know exactly what to say to make you open that door. But remember this too. Everything that exists can be destroyed. Everything that hunts can become prey. Even ancient things that feed on fear and cold can burn. Just keep your flares close. Keep your will strong. And never, ever open the door. They still find frozen bodies on that mountain road every winter. Some nights, drivers report seeing strange lights in the snow, hearing voices that speak in impossible harmonies. The local police have a special code for certain accidents they find: cars intact but empty, windows broken inward, strange marks in the frost that look almost like words. But those are just stories, aren't they? Emma Chun checked her GPS watch again. 4:47 p.m. The sun would set in less than an hour, and she was still 3 miles from the ranger station. She shouldn't have stayed so long photographing the frozen waterfall, but the ice formations had been too perfect to resist. Now she was paying for her professional enthusiasm. The snow had started falling 20 minutes ago, fat flakes that quickly transformed the mountain trail into a white dreamscape. Under different circumstances, it would have been perfect for her nature photography portfolio. But with temperature dropping and daylight fading, all she could think about was reaching the safety of the ranger station before dark. Her footsteps crunched in the fresh powder as she maintained a steady pace. The trail was well marked with reflective blazes every 50 yards, one of the reasons she'd chosen this particular route for her winter photography expedition. Even in low light, she should be able to follow them back. A twig snapped in the woods to her left. Emma stopped, breath fogging in the cold air. The snow seemed to muffle all sound, creating an unnatural silence. She waited, listening. Nothing. Probably a deer, she muttered, resuming her pace. She'd seen plenty of wildlife signs on the trail: deer tracks, rabbit prints, even what looked like wolf traces. All normal for this part of the Rockies in winter. The snow fell harder, reducing visibility to about 20 yards. Emma picked up her pace, looking for the next trail blaze. The reflective marker should have been visible by now. She walked another 50 yards. No blaze. Her heart rate picked up slightly. The markers were maintained religiously by the Park Service. There should be one visible at all times. Another twig snapped, closer this time. Emma spun toward the sound, her hand instinctively going to the bear spray on her belt. The woods were a wall of white, shadows lengthening between the trees as dusk approached. Something moved in those shadows, just a flicker of motion, there and gone. "Hello?" she called out. "Is someone there?" The silence swallowed her words. She turned back to the trail and froze. 20 yards ahead, barely visible in the falling snow, stood a figure. It was roughly human-shaped, but something about its proportions was wrong. It stood too tall, its limbs too long and thin. Snow collected on its shoulders, suggesting dark clothing, but its outline seemed to waver, as if it wasn't quite solid. "Hello!" Emma called again, her voice shakier now. "I'm headed to the ranger station. Are you lost?" The figure didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there, snow falling through it. Emma blinked hard, wondering if her eyes were playing tricks in the fading light. When she looked again, the figure was gone. "Get it together," she whispered to herself. "Just tricks of light and shadow. Focus on the trail." But which way was the trail? The snow was falling so heavily now that her own footprints were quickly disappearing. Without the blazes to guide her, another snap, this time behind her. Emma spun around. The figure stood 10 yards away, closer now. Still motionless, but its head was cocked at an impossible angle, as if its neck was broken. She could see no face in the shadow of what might have been a hood. "Who are you?" she demanded, trying to keep the fear from her voice. "What do you want?" The figure's head straightened with a sound like crackling ice. When it spoke, its voice was wrong, like multiple voices whispering slightly out of sync. "You're going the wrong way, Emma." Her blood ran cold. She hadn't told anyone on the trail her name. "How do you dash?" "The ranger station is this way," it said, raising an arm that seemed too long, fingers too thin and numerous. It pointed into the darkening woods. "I can show you." "No, thank you," Emma said firmly, backing away. "I'll find it myself." The figure took a step forward. The motion was wrong, not like walking, but like a film jumping frames. "But it's getting dark, Emma. You don't want to be out here in the dark. Not alone. Not with what hunts here." "Stay back," she warned, unclipping her bear spray. The figure cocked its head again, too far, until it was completely inverted. "Capsaicin doesn't work on things that don't breathe, little photographer. Would you like to know what does work?" The last photographer did. Right before she started screaming, Emma turned and ran. Emma's boots pounded through the deepening snow as she ran. Every survival instinct screamed that she was making a mistake. Running in a snowstorm was a perfect way to get lost, to exhaust yourself, to die of exposure. But the alternative was staying near that thing. She risked a glance over her shoulder. The figure was following, still maintaining that unnatural stop-motion movement. It didn't seem to be hurrying, yet somehow it wasn't falling behind. "Your heart is beating so fast," its layered voice called out. "The fear makes your blood warmer, more inviting." Emma forced herself to stop running. She was already breathing hard, sweat beginning to form under her winter gear. Dangerous in these temperatures. She had to think rationally. The GPS watch. She fumbled with the device, hands shaking. The screen was dark. "Electronics don't work well around me," the thing said, now somehow off to her left. Something about the cold. "Would you like to see what happened to the last person who tried to call for help? I kept their phone. And most of their fingers." Emma fought down rising panic. The light was fading fast now, the snow falling in near white sheets. She could barely see 20 feet in any direction. A sound cut through the wind, a high, keening whistle, like wind through bare bones. It was answered by another, further off, then another. The sounds seemed to be moving, circling. "My friends are coming," the figure said, now behind her. "They so rarely get to play anymore. The rangers are too good at warning people away. But you wandered right to us." Emma's training kicked in. She was a wilderness photographer. She had survival gear. She had her hand closed around the emergency flare in her jacket pocket. "The last one tried fire," the thing said, as if reading her thoughts. Its voice was closer now. "It didn't help. Nothing burns cold enough to hurt us." "Stay back," Emma warned, pulling out the flare. The figure flickered closer, its form seeming to glide over the snow. In the deepening darkness, she could see its shape more clearly, and wished she couldn't. What she'd taken for a hood was its actual head, smooth and eyeless, face split by a too-wide mouth filled with crystalline teeth. "Your kind always fights," it said, "always thinks there's hope. That's what makes it fun. Hope tastes like summer sunlight. We miss sunlight." The whistling sounds were closer now. Shadows moved in the swirling snow, suggesting more figures, more wrong proportions. Emma struck the flare. Brilliant red light exploded outward. The figure recoiled with a sound like cracking ice, its form wavering. The shadows in the snow retreated from the light. "You can't run forever," it hissed, its layered voice taking on a harder edge. "The flare will die. The cold will remain. We will remain." Emma used the light to check her surroundings. There, a reflective blaze on a tree, nearly hidden by snow but still visible. She was back on the trail. She began moving, keeping the flare held high. The figure and its companions paced her in the darkness beyond the light's reach. She could hear them moving, their whistling calls becoming angry, frustrated. "Clever girl," the thing said. "But do you know what happens when you burn a flare in a snowstorm? How the light reflects, how it blinds." As if on cue, the snow seemed to glow red, the light bouncing back from millions of falling flakes. Emma's night vision began to fail, the world dissolving into a crimson blur. "We don't need eyes to hunt," the voice whispered, now impossibly close. "We remember when there were no eyes, no light, no warmth. Just cold and dark and hunger." Something cold brushed Emma's neck. Emma swung the flare behind her blindly. There was a hiss like steam on ice, and the cold presence withdrew. But her eyes were nearly useless now, filled with floating red afterimages from the flare's reflection. "Poor little photographer," the thing mocked. "You understand light so well. How it bounces, how it bends. Did you know darkness can bend too? Would you like to see?" The shadows beyond the flare's reach began to move strangely, folding in on themselves like origami made of void. The whistling calls grew closer, more excited. Emma checked her flare, already half burned. Maybe 5 minutes left. The trail marker she'd spotted was behind her now, and she couldn't see the next one through the snow and her compromised vision. "The ranger station is so far," the voice said, now seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "You'll never make it, but if you give up now, we'll make it quick. Keep running." It laughed, a sound like avalanches in the distance. Well, the last one ran until their lungs froze. The screams sounded like breaking icicles. Emma's mind raced. The thing was right about the station being too far. But there was something else nearby, something she'd seen on the trail map. "The cave," she whispered. "What was that?" The thing asked, sudden interest in its layered voice. "The tourist cave. It was just off the trail, maybe a quarter-mile ahead. Used for guided tours in summer, closed for winter. But it would have walls, shelter, a place where she could see what was coming." "You're thinking of the cave," the thing said. "Clever. But do you really want to go underground? Into the dark? Into our domain?" Emma started moving again, sweeping the flare in wide arcs to keep the shadows at bay. The whistling shapes paced her, always just outside the light's reach. "We were born in caves," the voice continued. "In the time before time, when the world was cold and dark. We remember. The cave remembers too. Can you feel it calling?" She could. There was a weight to the darkness ahead, a sense of ancient patience. But she kept moving. The flare was burning lower. 1 minute left, the thing said cheerfully. "Would you like to know what your eyes will look like when they freeze? They turn such interesting colors." The flare sputtered. The shadows crept closer. But there a darker patch in the swirling white. The cave entrance. Emma ran for it as the flare gave one final surge and died. Darkness crashed in around her like a physical wave. Cold fingers brushed her back, her arms, her neck, but she kept moving. She hit the cave entrance hard, stumbling into the darkness. The temperature dropped immediately, the air tasting of old stone and older ice. The whistling sounds echoed off the walls, distorting, multiplying. Shadows moved in shadows. "Welcome home," the thing said, its voice reverberating strangely in the cave. "We've waited so long for someone to visit. The rangers put up such annoying signs. Cave closed for winter. Danger. If they only knew the real danger." Emma backed deeper into the cave, her free hand finding the wall. Her eyes were adjusting to the darkness, picking out shapes she wished she couldn't see. The thing flowed through the cave entrance, its form more liquid now, less bothering with human appearance. Behind it came others, shapes that hurt her eyes, geometries that shouldn't exist. Nowhere left to run, it said. No more light to save you. Just cold and dark and us. Emma smiled. You talk too much, she said, and pulled out her second flare. The thing's crystalline teeth gleamed. We told you. Fire doesn't work on us. No, Emma agreed. But magnesium burns at 4,000 degrees. Hot enough to turn rock to steam. She struck the flare against the cave wall. The magnesium ignited with a sound like thunder, the flash reflecting off the ice-covered walls, multiplying, amplifying. The cave turned into a chamber of mirrors, light bouncing everywhere at once. The creatures screamed, a sound like glaciers calving, like the death of stars. Their forms began to dissolve in the amplified light, shadow and cold burning away. Light doesn't just illuminate, Emma said, advancing with the flare. It's energy, heat, the opposite of everything you are. The things tried to retreat, but the cave walls worked against them now, reflecting the killing light from every angle. Their forms lost cohesion, streaming away like snow in a blowtorch. The main creature made one last attempt to reach her, its body already half gone. We are eternal, it hissed. We are the cold between stars. We are dashed. You are nothing, Emma said, and thrust the flare into what remained of its face. The thing burst like a soap bubble, its substance vanishing with a sound like a dying scream. The other shapes followed, burning away in the relentless light until nothing remained but normal shadows. Emma stood in the cave entrance until the flare burned out, watching the snow fall. It looked natural now, just frozen water, nothing more. When she finally made it to the ranger station an hour later, they asked why she was so late. She told them about getting lost in the snow, about taking shelter in the cave. She didn't mention what she'd seen. Who would believe her? But that spring, when the cave reopened for tours, visitors reported strange marks on the walls. Deep grooves that looked almost like claw marks, patches where the stone had melted and reformed. And on the coldest winter nights, when snow falls thick and silent, people sometimes hear whistling sounds in the darkness. High, lonely sounds, like wind through bare bones, like something ancient and cold calling out in hunger. But those are just stories, aren't they? Emma still takes pictures in the mountains, but never in winter, never alone. She keeps flares in her camera bag now, more than she can explain to other photographers. And sometimes, when the snow starts falling and the light begins to fade, she thinks she sees shapes moving in the shadows between snowflakes. But she keeps her flares close, keeps moving, remembers that even the oldest cold can burn, that even the deepest dark fears the light. And if you're ever alone in the snow, when darkness falls and strange whistles echo through the trees, remember that some things that walk in winter are older than time, colder than space, hungrier than any natural predator. But remember this too, they can be fought, they can be beaten. Just keep your light burning, and never, ever follow them into the dark.
If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more like it, please don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing and clicking the notification bell to join our storytelling community. Your support means the world to me. Until next time, sweet dreams, or perhaps pleasant nightmares.